like many things, not everything fits perfectly to the perfect ideal math. Some of you seem to be indicating that you actually eat fewer calories than this would predict, which would then predict that you should be losing weight very readily, and yet you're not. And that is because there are other factors that come into all this. These figures are good calculations for when everything's operating pretty normally. But we don't always operate in perfect normal fashion because, and this is where my area comes in, my two areas of specialization are hormones and exercise. The reason they go together is because they both affect one another. Hormones are affected by exercise, and exercise affects hormones as well. I kind of like to start usually with trying to understand a little bit about the hormonal side of things. So, Laura, for example, you've heard a lot of this before. You even mentioned survival mode, which is, you'll hear about it in a moment for those who haven't heard it before. But let me start then with trying to explain something about what's happening as we age. I put it this way, a very significant part of the aging process is our ever-changing relationship with the sugar molecule, basically glucose. Just about everything we eat ultimately gets turned into, except for proteins, gets turned into energy to fuel our bodies. And that relationship is changing with time. A good way to start to understand it, something else you've heard before, I had a roommate in college who was a type 1 diabetic, which means he was diabetic almost from birth. He could not produce insulin. And he said something to me that helps to illustrate my point. He said to me that a type 1 diabetic like himself could starve to death in a room full of food, which sounds really strange. You fill a room with food, and how could you starve to death? But a type 1 diabetic without insulin can do nothing with the food. Their body can't process it into energy. And this is where hormones start to maybe fill in some missing picture here. There are numerous hormones involved in being able to make energy out of food. Insulin is one of them. Kind of think of it this way. Insulin is, you might think of it as a solvent. It's its purpose is to get food particles, energy particles, into the cell membranes, through the cell membranes, so that they can get inside the cells where energy can be made out of that material. So without insulin, it can't get in the cells. The door's locked. It can't get there. So you have to have insulin. That one we know. However, after it gets into the cells, what happens then? Well, there are structures inside the cells of your bodies called mitochondria that make the ultimate energy form, the energy you actually spend when you're moving, doing anything, which is adenosine triphosphate, ATP for short. So these mitochondria get the energy particles into the cell, after they go into the cell, and they manufacture ATP, which is what you ultimately burn for energy. Well, the mitochondria are influenced by the presence of thyroid hormone. If you don't have enough thyroid, the cells work, the mitochondria run at a very slow pace. In fact, if you're low enough, they may do almost nothing. I know of a child who died not too long ago because of mitochondrial disease. And one of the ways they treated her was to try to stimulate what little mitochondria she had to make some energy. She ultimately did not live. So in other words, the mitochondria have to make energy, and they're stimulated by thyroid. So thyroid is the second hormone. If you don't have enough of it, you're not going to make much energy out of the food you eat. Third one is growth hormone. It's made by the pituitary gland in the brain. And it's a little harder to understand growth hormone. Growth hormone sets what's called the insulin sensitivity. That is the rate at which insulin can work to get through the membrane. And I illustrate this. How many people have had an occasion sometime in your life where you did a tremendous amount of activity, really probably pretty strenuous too, and afterwards you were just starving, couldn't wait to sit down and eat a meal. You sat down and ate a huge meal, and 2 hours later you were hungry again. Did that ever happen to anybody? Mm-hmm. I mean, probably sometime in your life you can remember an occasion like that. Well, that happened because you released a lot of growth hormone. The body says, you just burned a lot of calories, I need to replace them, get them back into the cells and get some energy rebuilt that I just spent. So it releases a lot of growth hormone to make you very insulin sensitive. So you can absorb a lot of energy fast. So growth hormone is the third hormone that's needed to make energy out of food. If you have really low growth hormone, you have insulin resistance instead of sensitivity. Everything runs more slowly. Everything slows down. Now I say this is related to this because as each of these hormones varies in its presence, in quantity, you could be operating less than optimally, which will mean you may predict that you need a certain number of calories, you're eating fewer than that, but your hormones aren't running optimally.
How do you know where your growth hormone is? Is that determined by a blood test?
Yeah, there are blood tests.
Do your panel?
They usually measure what's called the insulin-like growth factor 1.
Oh, okay, so it's in your blood work.
So that's the third one. Sex hormones are also part of this picture. They're not directly involved in what we'll call the metabolism of energy synthesis. They're really more involved with tissue synthesis. The sex hormones are more involved with building material, building cells, building tissue, muscle, skin, hair, eye tissue, everything. But these hormones work very closely with the pituitary gland because the body knows if you build cells, you got to feed them. If you're going to feed them, you need growth hormone. So they tend to increase or stimulate growth hormone production to make sure you can feed these cells. So in other words, if you have really low sex hormones, you're probably going to have low growth hormone, you might have lower thyroid and so on, and the whole system slows down. So sex hormones are another part of it. So that's 4 hormones. The fifth one, we won't get into too much detail, but they're produced by the adrenal glands. The corticosteroids produced by your adrenal glands also play a role in the ability to metabolize energy from fat and carbohydrates. And maybe one way to understand it is, if you think about what it must have been like living in primitive times, you had 2 kinds of stress. I mean, you didn't have work stress. You didn't have the wife stress, or at least not much probably. Yet most of the stress you knew was either the stress, short-term stress, because you were out foraging for food, climbing trees and walking around, and suddenly you're being chased by a predator, and you got to run as fast and as far as you can to get away. That's short-term stress. Adrenaline was the hormone the body dumps for that short-term stress. Long-term stress, on the other hand, wasn't the constant stress we face today: road rage, job stress, financial stress, emotional stress. I mean, our lives are a lot more complicated than probably they were for a primitive man. So long-term stress in primitive times was starvation. There wasn't enough food. So your body developed a mixture of hormones to slow down how much you were burning and how much you were putting into storage. You might think of it this way. You get a paycheck for $100. When you're a teenager and you have really tremendous hormones, you get $98 to spend, almost the whole check. Well, when you're 55, 60 years old, you get that same $100, maybe you get $40. The rest goes in the bank. That's sort of what happens as we get older. We're gradually putting more and more of what we eat into energy, into storage, fat storage, and getting less and less of it to spend in our cells. And that's where the aging process is taking us. It's naturally going to take us further and further to storing more of what we eat and burning less of it. And why? Because that helps you survive. If there's less food, long-term stress, we're getting older, there's another stressor, and so it can help you to survive on less food. But consequently, many people end up with a profile where they're in what I call survival mode. That is, their body still thinks it's in primitive times, and all the stress that we have is interpreted by the body as, there must not be enough food. I better slow everything down to keep you alive. But in fact, what it ends up doing is it ends up making you gain weight because everything you eat goes into storage and very little of it is given to you to spend. That's one of the things we want to try to change. That can be changed by working with Dr. Cruz to review your hormone levels, try to get them all to optimal points so that you've got the hormones to work with. So that's a quickie overview of the hormone side of things. Anybody have any questions about that?
I just have one.
Yeah.
I have that you had the thyroid and the growth hormone involved in that. What was the third one?
Let's see, first we did insulin, then we talked about thyroid, then growth hormones, sex hormones.
Okay, so insulin was one of the top three that metabolize energy?
You have to have insulin to get it into
Okay.
the cells. You need the thyroid to make the cells go to work. You need growth hormone to help the insulin move in and out of the cell more or less rapidly. You need the sex hormones to help stimulate growth hormone. And then you finally need corticosteroids in the process too. That's a little harder to explain. They're part of it.
Right.
They're part of metabolizing fats and carbohydrates. If you're low on any one of these hormones, you've got a logjam. Food is sitting in your bloodstream way too long and not going to your cells. And ultimately, because you're less insulin sensitive, the body can't shove it into the cells quickly, and it's putting it into body fat. When you're young, you drink a bottle of soda, and 20 minutes later, you're running down the road burning it. When you're 55, 60 years old, you could drink that same soda. It might take several hours before you see a dime of it, because you're just less sensitive. These are all really useful to help you to start to put the picture together, because it's a moving picture, this one. So let's see, we just wanted to talk about the hormones a little bit first, to get a picture there.